Chapter 10. Last Chance to Leave. Ranger ran to find Patrick. He weaved through a crowd of third-class passengers who had made their way up to the boat deck. He squeezed between first-class men and women in their coats and hats. Another rocket exploded over the ship. Finally, Ranger found Patrick, helping a young woman into a life jacket. He ran to him, barking, but Patrick didn't hear. Ranger barked louder. Suddenly, the noise from the ship's great funnels quieted. Passengers stared up at them, startled by the silence. Ranger barked again. This time, Patrick looked over. Ranger pawed at his leg. Then he ran toward the gate where the children were. "Hold on, dog." Patrick was turning a crank, helping to lower another lifeboat. As Patrick worked, he scanned the crowd. He hadn't seen Miriam or Hamad or anyone from their village yet, but maybe they were on the starboard side of the ship. Perhaps they'd already been lowered to safety. They were children, after all. Someone would be looking out for them now. As soon as the lifeboat splashed into the water, Ranger was at Patrick's side, jumping up on him with both legs, running back and forth. Finally, Patrick followed Ranger through the crowd to the gate. "I said no." Miriam was still struggling with the frustrated crewman who was trying to move her toward the lifeboats. When she spotted Patrick, she shouted, "Tell him to let me go." Patrick hurried over. What's this about?" "I've been ordered to get the third-class women and children into boats," the steward said, still clutching Miriam's arm. "But he won't let Hamad come." Miriam's eyes shined with angry tears. Patrick looked at the steward. "He's a boy." "Almost a man," the steward said. "I'm 10 years old," Hamad shouted. The steward looked at Patrick and shook his head. "He looks older. They won't let him in the boat. If I send him up, he's likely to get shot." Patrick swallowed hard. He'd seen crew members firing pistols in the air, threatening men who tried to force their way onto boats. Would they shoot a child? Before Patrick could argue any more, there was shouting on the deck. 4 men were trying to force their way to the lifeboats. The steward turned toward the commotion. As soon as he looked away, Hamad scrambled over the gate and raced to his sister's side. She grabbed his hand and looked up at Patrick. "Now you can take us to the lifeboat." Patrick's stomach twisted. What would he do if Hamad wasn't allowed on a lifeboat? The crew members on the port deck were getting more short-tempered by the minute. Patrick understood. It was taking too long to move the passengers. Lifeboats were being lowered half full. The emergency staircase that led to the sea deck was already flooding. The lights that lit the steps glowed an eerie green under the seawater. They were running out of time. But Hamad didn't wait for Patrick. He was already leading his sister through the crowd. Patrick and Ranger followed them to the deck. When they arrived, a family was standing near lifeboat 14. The little girl was wrapped in a white star-lined blanket. Her mother wore a man's overcoat. "Stay back," an officer shouted to a man who was creeping forward. "Let's go." A steward took the girl from her parents and guided her to the lifeboat. "Now you too," he shouted to the mother. "Take a seat in the boat." "Go, Lottie," her husband shouted as the sailors pulled her toward the boat. "Go and be brave. I'll get a seat in another boat." Patrick watched him step back into a crowd of other men. The man's grim face made it clear he knew the truth. There wouldn't be enough boats for everyone. Patrick was about to ask one of the officers about Hamad when a teenage boy jumped into the lifeboats beside the woman and her daughter. The woman in the boat tried to help him, hiding him under their skirts. One of the officers pointed a gun at the boy. "I'll give you 10 seconds to get back onto that ship." The boy climbed back over the rail and collapsed onto the deck. Patrick turned away. He tried to tune out the sound of the boys crying, but Miriam had seen what happened. She stared at the boy, and her eyes filled with tears. Ranger licked Miriam's hand, but it didn't help. He didn't know what could make things better, with everyone so upset. Hamad wasn't crying, but his eyes were big and scared. Ranger sat down beside him and leaned into him. Miriam wiped her tears with her sleeve, just as a first-class lady arrived to board a boat. She wore a long wool coat over her gown and a pile of hats on her head. Many people on deck wore layers of clothing, trying to save what they could from the flooding ship. Miriam stared at that pile of hats. Then she broke away from Patrick and Hamad and raced to the woman's side. "Miriam," Patrick called. She was going to get herself in trouble again. "Come back." Miriam ignored him. She tugged on the woman's sleeve and said something. The woman looked surprised. Miriam pointed at Hamad, and the woman looked up. Her face softened. She nodded, took off one of her hats, and gave it to Miriam. Miriam raced back to Hamad and held out the hat. "Hurry, put this on your head." "What?" Hamad stared at the hat. It had a wide brim with flowers and a bow piled on top. "They won't let boys on a lifeboat," Miriam whispered, "so you'll have to be a girl instead." With that, she shoved the hat onto his head. Hamad began to protest. "I'm not wearing," but Patrick cut him off. "She's right," he said. "You can pass for a girl." He grabbed a blanket around someone had left on the deck. He wrapped it around Hamad's shoulders and pulled the brim of the hat lower to hide his face. Patrick stepped back to look at Hamad. Then he leaned close to the children and whispered, "Don't say another word now. This may be your only chance to get off the ship." Chapter 11. Hiding in plain sight. Lifeboat 14 had already been lowered to A deck. Patrick grabbed Hamad and Miriam's hand and headed for the next boat. Crew members hurried past, shouting to one another, "We need help on the boat deck. Any more women down there?" Patrick peered down at the deck below and caught a glimpse of Mr. Andrews. In the dim light, he and the other men were tossing steamer chairs over the railing into the sea. Patrick frowned. What was the point? Getting rid of weight on the sinking ship wasn't going to keep it afloat. But then Patrick saw one of the chairs bobbing in the waves. A man who'd already fallen or jumped from the Titanic was swimming desperately toward it. Mr. Andrews wasn't throwing chairs overboard to get rid of weight on the ship. He was throwing them so people in the water could use them as rafts. Patrick felt a chill that had nothing to do with the icy air. He looked around the ship at the crowds of people and the few remaining lifeboats. They weren't even close to enough. Patrick knew most crew members would be the last to leave. What would he do when the ship finally sank beneath the waves? Would he cling to the railing until the last possible second? Or would it be better to jump clear of the ship and hope to swim to a lifeboat or floating chair? Patrick shivered again. He couldn't imagine choosing that frigid black water. "Will they let Hamad go in a boat now?" Miriam whispered to Patrick. "Yes," Patrick said, but he had no idea if the disguise would work. He pushed all of the cold water thoughts from his mind and pulled the children toward the next boat. Ranger stayed close as they stepped up to the railing. "I brought up 2 young sisters from 3rd class," Patrick told the officer loading the boat. "Have you then?" the officer said. His eyes settled on Miriam, then drifted to Hamad. "Into the boat you go." The officer held a hand out to the children and helped them into their lifeboat. 24 passengers were already crowded into the little boat. A woman from Miriam and Hamad's village spotted them and reached up with her arms held out. Patrick prayed she wouldn't call Hamad's name. She didn't. She simply took Miriam's hand and helped her settle on the bench. Hamad sat by his sister and stared up at Patrick. Miriam lifted her hand in a quiet wave. "Be safe," Patrick called. He swallowed hard. "I'll see you when we get to New York." The last word stuck in his throat. He stepped back from the railing, wishing he could have said a better goodbye. There would be no grand arrival in New York. He understood now. Below, in the waves, another lifeboat was pulling away. Soon the last lifeboats would follow, and there would be no hope for those. Patrick would go down with the ship he'd helped to build. "Lower aft," an officer shouted as the crew maneuvered Lifeboat 15 down the side of the ship. "Lower stern. Now together." "Come on," an officer clapped Patrick. "We've got a few to launch yet." Patrick followed the officer and helped to load Lifeboat 2. With every minute that passed, the Titanic seemed to lurch a bit more. There were more shouts, more cries, more panic. And there were still so many people on the ship. The air crackled with danger. Ranger smelled fear on every passenger's breath. How could he possibly help them all?